To those of you who are in the room and have made this trip all the way to Birmingham, or just down the road to Birmingham for some of you, I know, or indeed for those of you who are joining us virtually online. I'm delighted to say that we've got over 200 participants either live in the building or who are joining us at the moment virtually. You're all very welcome to this event. This is the 8th running of Joining the Dots, and as I was reflecting on that this morning, it feels like it's been a long old journey, sort of through various venues and pandemics and having to run the event virtually and now hybrid. But we'd really appreciate your feedback actually on sort of the value of that, trying to sort of serve the needs of colleagues up and down the country, some who are obviously able to be here and join us in person and get the benefit of the networking, the coffee, the pastries, and those sorts of things. And also those of you for whom actually travelling just isn't an option, and therefore the hybrid setup that we've got running today hopefully will allow you to participate fully. We've got virtual hosts as well, so there will be at least a couple of members of the team who are online to welcome you, to make sure that we can address any technical issues, to funnel some of your questions and comments into the room as well. For those of you who don't know me, my name's Dan Campsell. I am the chairman of Agilisys, and it's my privilege to kick off proceedings today and to chair us through the first session this morning, welcoming some of our speakers. It means that I get the opportunity to express our enormous appreciation not only to you as delegates and attendees, but also to our sponsors. So events like this, as you'll be aware, just don't work without having some of the sponsors and partners who work with us to support the event. So delighted to have Unoptic and Vivacity and Geist and also Wescatec as our silver partners for this event. But also we've got Acusensus and C-Sense who are exhibitors today as well. So do go and find them during the breaks. There's Unoptic and Vivacity are here. The other four are out in the atrium where you can find your coffee and refreshments. Because actually, one of the things that's quite nice about this, you know, the road safety community is quite small, but the guys from these companies are people that we have known for many years as well in many cases, and they have demonstrated their long-term commitment to the road safety community by the products and services that they offer and also by the support that they give to events like this. So it's a while ago that we started to plan the content for today, and you know, we were exploring what are some of the, always kind of asking the question, you know, what's the framework around which we are going to build this event. And I had just fairly recently come off doing a podcast with one of our speakers today, talking about, well, actually we'd ended up in a whole conversation around gender gaps in the data. Some of you will be familiar with Cristina Criado Perez's book, Invisible Women. And it got us thinking, actually, from a safety perspective, are there bits that we're missing within the data landscape? Have we got, is there data about inequality that we've just not missed? Or is there data that's missing that would speak to some of the inequalities that are out there and that do exist? And so I'm really pleased to say that particularly this first session this morning is going to drill into that issue and explore it in some measure. Just before I do introduce our keynote to start the day, a couple of housekeeping bits. We're not expecting a fire alarm today. You might have seen on the sign there, Thursday is when fire alarm happens. So that means if the alarm does go off, then we do need to evacuate the building using the fire escapes that are marked. If you want to access the Wi-Fi, then the network is available, and is it customer first? All right. That's a very highways, in national highways sort of thing, isn't it? Customer first. Yeah, I don't know that they did that just for delegates who are here today, but anyway, there we go. That's the Wi-Fi password, should you need it. So let's get into the content for today. So as I said, I met our keynote speaker when we were doing a podcast together last year and talking about some of these issues. Marianne Weinreich comes from Ramboll in Copenhagen, and she's well experienced at sort of addressing the conference circuit around Europe, particularly talking about cycling. She also represents the Danish Cycling Embassy, is that? And so has got a huge amount to say about the cycling piece, but actually has also become a bit of a voice for some of the gaps that exist in the data. And so when we were thinking about the content for today and looking to put the agenda together, it made an awful lot of sense to ask her to come to the UK and share some of her data and her insights with us. So would you welcome our keynote speaker, Marianne Weinreich.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. And always when I'm in native English-speaking countries, I apologize for my Euro-English, but I'm doing the best I can. So, yes, I'm going to talk to you about gender and mobility. And during the presentation, when I say men and women, I will refer to what is the majority of men or women doing according to data. That does not mean that I'm talking about all women or all men, just to have that disclaimer here. I will also be talking about safety and security. Since this is a traffic safety expert room, I just want to say that when I use safety, it's traffic safety injuries. When I say security, I'm talking about that feeling of personal security related to harassment, assault, and other more feelings-based insecurities. Just to clarify that. And yes, I am from a company called Ramboll, and I'll just say a little bit more about that. And I chair the Cycling Embassy of Denmark. And yes, I do ride a bicycle in heels because it's just so much easier than walking in heels. So Ramboll is a Danish-founded, but now international engineering and design consultancy. We are also here in the UK, but around the world, over 16,000 people. I am market manager in our smart mobility division that has its international division with offices in these 9 countries, including the UK. And the report that I'm going to talk about today, the research was done in 7 out of these 9 countries, not in Australia and not in the UK, because those countries were not part of smart mobility when we did the research. But the report is part of a series of so-called green papers, discussion papers, that we do every year, where we choose a topic within sustainability related to that, a hot topic that we feel it's still new and a lot of insights or data is missing. So with partners, we investigate. We've been looking into mobility as a service. We've been looking into micromobility. And then we decided in 2020 to have a paper on gender and mobility. And the reason was an invitation. I got to speak in Berlin at the Danish Embassy about gender and mobility. And to be honest, even though I've been working in transport and mobility for over 20 years, it was not a topic that had been addressed, which was then surprising. It was like, yeah, in EU projects, you count how many men and women are in this meeting, how many men and women are we addressing with the activities we do, but that's kind of the level. So I read Invisible Women by Carolina Criado Perez that you just referred to, and I got really, really angry and really, really upset. And I see people nodding, especially women nodding, because you get really upset as a woman when you read that book. And I went to our director and I said, we have to do something or I will just explode. So that's why this data collection here is a response to a need that we felt was there. The transport industry is one of the male-dominated industries, like politics, like medicine, like tech. There are many industries that are male-dominated. In transport in Europe, it's about 80% men. And that means that there is, and has been identified also in research, an unconscious bias in planning towards male travel patterns and male preferences in transport. And lack of representation of women also underlines that, along with the gender data gap. And for instance, it means that many meetings I've attended over the last 22 years are like this, that I am the odd one, the strange one in the picture. Because as the book Invisible Women also points out, is that through history and culture and unconsciously, we have created a norm where the average, the normal, the standard human being is a man. And everything that is different than that, meaning women, or different than the standard male, is something different, is not weird, but what's the word now that I'm missing in English? The deviation. And that means that is often overlooked or not included in planning and design. Since this was a traffic safety conference, I want to highlight one of the examples in the book in transport. There are many, but one of them are the fact that women are more likely to get seriously injured in a car crash while driving the car, because all the safety features are designed for standard height, weight, and body male. And since we women have a different body type, different proportions, have a wider pelvis, we have breasts, the type of injuries that women have are different. But until last year, there was not a crash test dummy that was female. There were dummies that were put in tests on the passenger seat, but it was basically a scaled down male crash test dummy, basically a teenage boy, not resembling a woman. So that is one of the data gaps that we have in transport and specifically in traffic safety when it comes to inside the vehicle. What I want to talk about today is data about gender differences when it comes to access to traveling, to the experience of traveling with different modes. The report, Gender and Smart Mobility, has been done with collection of existing data in the 7 countries that you saw on the screen. We have interviewed gender and mobility experts in all those countries. We have done a survey of 3,500 men and women, 500 in each of the capitals in those 7 countries. And we have interviewed in focus group interviews 40 women from the 7 countries. And I picked some highlight of the data that I'll be sharing today. And the report is done in cooperation with public transport in Helsinki, in Stockholm, in Berlin, and the Swedish Trafikverket. So they have supported this report. But the main conclusion that I would like to start with is that even though it is what most people think and believe, transport is not gender neutral. It is actually, according to International Transport Forum, World Bank, and other big organizations that have also looked at all the research into this, one of the key determinants of how we travel and our transport choices. And that's because transport is a product of a lot of things. It's a product of what we need to do in our daily lives. And that means that it is highly influenced by the structural gender differences that we still see in society. The fact that the paid workforce still higher paid workforce participation by men than by women. More women have part-time work than men. We also see there's a gender pay gap. That's also an influence. We see that paternity leave, the majority of the paternity leave is still the woman that stays at home during paternity leave. So some of all these structural differences play into how we travel and the choices and the what we are able to access. For instance, cars are expensive. We also see that, for instance, the maternity leave has an influence on our travel patterns, but I'll get back to that. What we see in data in all the 7 countries is there are differences between the levels, but we still see the same tendency. Women walk more than men. Women use public transport more than men. Men drive more cars and use new mobility services like e-scooters and other things more than women. With cycling, that was the only mode that there was a difference between the countries. In Denmark, we didn't include the Netherlands, but it's also the case there. We have a 50-50% men and women cycling. That is not the case in most other countries. It varies if it's 60, 70, or 80% men cycling. And I'll get back to some of the explanations for that. Some of those structural differences that I mentioned in the beginning also means that men and women looking at data in general have different travel patterns. We usually in the transport sector talk about traveling from A to B, but that is in fact more a male travel pattern. Men travel longer, but have a more simple travel pattern, usually homework and then back to home. Whereas many women, and that's linked to these structural differences, have a more complex travel pattern. They travel shorter distances, but have multiple stops. And it's called trip chaining, and have multiple stops, but shorter distances, often accompanying children. Because that is something that starts usually with maternity leave, that you start that pattern and continue with that. So we have these differences, but what we actually cater for in transport planning is peak hour travel and commuting. And the off-peak hour traveling pattern that is that one is often not catered for instance, in public transport. So that gives some challenges for the people having those needs. But also there is a different when it comes to the experience of traveling. Women are more likely to think about which route to take, especially at night, but also worry more about harassment and assault, and particularly with walking and public transport, think a lot about where am I waiting, and maybe actually not doing trips because of those insecurities and fears. So it can be limiting. This looks strange. That was not supposed to have, but never mind. What this shows, or if you could see it, is that the three challenges that in the survey of the 3,500 men and women in 5 capitals in the world showed that they were asked which challenges, barriers do you experience when traveling, and then all the different modes. And they were also asked which associations they had with the different modes. And I want to highlight some of the answers of the gender disaggregated data that we pulled out. That the, if you could see it, it's weather conditions, traveling with groceries and bag, and travel time for walking that are the top 3 barriers. But when it comes to traveling with groceries and bags, there's actually significantly more women having that as a barrier. When it comes to cycling, we see that it's weather, traffic safety, and traveling with groceries and bags. And we see that when it comes to cycling, significantly more women than men address traffic safety as one of the key barriers. And that is, according to a lot of research, one of the key reasons why in Denmark and the Netherlands we have a 50-50% men and women cycling, because we have networks of protected bike lanes. It is, relatively speaking, very safe to cycle, and that means that women do it to a great extent. And actually, the Australian researcher Jan Girard refers to the share of women cycling in a city as an indicator for how safe it is to cycle in that city. So basically, you can walk into the streets and count men and women cycling, and the ratio will tell you how safe it is to cycle here. So that is something that is very key when planning for cycling, including and planning for women, and really understanding that is a key need for women. When it comes to cars, on the association part, we see that on the 5th place, women have feeling of personal security as association to cars. That's the only mode that that came up. And we need to understand that also when we are asking people to get out of the cars, walk more, cycle more, that if it's unsafe to cycle and they actually, traffic safety-wise, unsafe to cycle, and they feel personally secure inside the car, then it's like double trouble here with what we are asking women to do. So we need to address these concerns. I'm not going to go into public transport that much. We did the survey in December 2020. So, of course, everything related to public transport was COVID. So, but also traveling with groceries and bags, and also feeling of insecurity came up. And I'll get back to that now, because in the focus groups, that was something that came up a lot. We did these focus groups online in the start of 2020, in the beginning of 2021. And when we got together and discussed the findings from the focus group interviews, we had basically from 7 different capitals in the world heard the exact identical stories from the women, the 40 women in the focus group interviews. They talk about how they have developed strategies when walking and using public transport, especially at night, strategies around carrying keys in the pocket, in between the fingers, ready, pretending to be on the phone, actually being on the phone, trying to look unapproachable or bigger in the colder countries with bigger jackets, changing shoes from heels to running shoes, just being alert and prepared. And also when planning their journeys, really thinking about where do I have to change and can I avoid changing. They say we would rather have a longer journey than having to stop, for instance, at a bus stop where they don't know the condition. And when it comes to cycling, except in Denmark, the women said, we really want more cycling infrastructure. It's just crucial for us to have it. But the women in Denmark said, on my bike, I'm invincible. I'm in control. I can outbike anybody if I feel insecure. So it's super empowering, and it fits the chores I need to do during the day. It's so relevant for those short trip chaining way of traveling, because it's so easy to just park your bicycle and get on with it. So last thing, all of this, there's so much more in the report. These are just kind of cherry picks. But we have 25 recommendations in the report as well. And basically it is these 5 headlines: include gender mainstreaming as a strategic approach when planning and designing transport. Collect data and gender disaggregate the data so you understand the differences. Really study, include, and interview and look at data about the users, their needs and their concerns. And thirdly, don't victimize women, but include safety and security as a parameter when planning and designing. And then also include and have measures and be aware of making sure that women are also included on in the departments, on in all levels in our transport sector, because representation matters in the discussions. Thank you so much for having the opportunity to present this for you today. Yes.
Great, that's fantastic. Thank you for running us through that. We've probably got time for just 1 or maybe 2 questions. If there are any hands up in the room, then we'll go to you. There's a question there, and then I've got one that's come in from online as well. Let me just come through here with the microphone. Alan.
Thank you. That was really interesting. But you mentioned that data was collected from 5 and sometimes 7 capital cities. Do you think that outcome would be different if you looked at urban areas and further out into the countryside where public transport is far fewer and further between, and the challenges there are potentially even more for females because they're more remote?
Yes, of course, we didn't look into it, so I can't say if it's the case, but in the research that we've also come across, it seems that it's a general trend, but of course it's emphasized, especially with public transport, in the bigger city where there's more public transport. You're much more depending on the car, for instance, in more rural areas. But it would be interesting to look into.
Okay, and one of the question that's come in from some of our participants online, and I don't know whether you'll know the answer to this, but it's a really interesting one. In countries where there is more equal parental leave, so this sort of disparity between maternity and paternity leave, does that lead to different trip patterns after they have children? Do we see more examples, see more men taking shorter trips, for example? Did you identify anything along those lines?
One of the experts, the Danish one, identified that we have the same trend, for instance, in Denmark, even though we also have men have but for instance, in Sweden, where it's even better conditions, we still see this pattern, but we also see much more men traveling with children. And my point is, if we cater for the needs of women traveling with prams and children, it's entering buses, stations, it's a hassle. We automatically cater for all the men who will hopefully, who are already doing it, but also in the future will do it. So it's a way of making the user experience in general better for everybody. Also for mobility impaired. These are not solutions that just work for women. They actually work in general for everybody.
Yeah. So we found some very similar findings when you look at the policy measures that work for older road users. Actually, you make an environment that's conducive for them. It makes it conducive for everyone. It's really interesting. Could we just express our appreciation to Mayena once more time?
Thank you.
Great. Okay, well, look, we're moving straight into our first session. And I can see she's just gathering her stuff and running down to the front because our first speaker in this session is Rachel Aldred. Rachel, I'm sure, will be known to many of you for her extensive work, particularly around cycling. And she's going to be talking to us about inequalities in self-reported injury risk. So delighted to have you with us, Rachel. Do feel free to make yourself comfortable. Look at that. And hopefully we should be able to jump straight into your slides. Thanks ever so much.
Lovely, thank you. And yeah, what a great keynote. Thank you very much, Mariana. And one thing that I just wanted to mention was that from some of my own research, one reason to get more women working in the transport sector is that as road users, they pose much lower risk to others than men do. So they're safer on the roads for other people. You would rather have a woman driving your HGV than a man. And indeed, I'm going to get a female-led removals company to help me move house next week. So, inequalities in self-reported injury risk. So this is talking about some research that I conducted looking at the National Travel Survey data. So I'm going to talk a little bit about injury risk data gaps, say something about the data that I used and the research that was conducted, give you some results, and then a brief conclusion. So I'm sure this audience, people in the room are quite aware, and online indeed, are very aware of data gaps we have in relation to injury risk. But I just wanted to set the context for why I wanted to use this kind of quite novel data source to look at injury risk. So as we know, police injury data, Stats 19, as it's known in this country, is pretty good in many ways. It's got the injury location, which is good for spatial analysis, the mode of transport, but it's got limited victim demographics. We don't know if the victim is a disabled person or not, for instance. It's also got information on vehicles involved, which is really important. We have systematic underreporting, we know this. The data on deaths is very accurate, but the data on slight injuries is, only a minority of slight injuries are reported. It doesn't have pedestrian falls, which is obviously quite important if we're thinking about pedestrian experiences, particularly for older people. And we think that probably incidents that don't involve a motor vehicle may be particularly underreported. So again, this is important for pedestrians. People may possibly have worked with hospital episode statistics data. This has its own set of pluses and minuses. One big problem is it's very hard to get access to because it's NHS data, which is understandable. But I discovered a few years ago that the National Travel Survey had some really interesting data on road injuries. Since 2007, it's asked a question about road accidents, as it's described. Now, this includes pedestrian falls, which I was just very, very interested when I heard this. And therefore, we've got data from our National Travel Survey, which again is a kind of fairly gold standard study. Again, there are problems with travel surveys. I'm sure we're all aware of these, but it's pretty good, the National Travel Survey. So it's got data on self-report injuries. And so, this isn't the true picture, the real picture, but it provides a different angle on injury. And it has many, many more incidents than police or hospital data, which is important because, of course, it's a sample survey. It's not everybody. It's 10,000 households a year, something like that. But it also has many, many demographic factors. So we can look at things like ethnicity, disability, stuff that you don't have in Stats 19, which again is really interesting. Now, one caveat, this injury data, the full data set I used, is called the secure data set. And it has a lot of access controls, so I had to go through quite a lot of hoops to access it, and I had to access it in a virtual secure space, so the analysis I could do was limited, but still useful, I think. So just to give you a sense of what is asked in the National Travel Survey of people in relation to road injuries. So they're asked about involvement in road injuries incidents in the past 3 years or 1 year. Oh, they're not asked about just injuries themselves, but also incidents they were involved in generally. So the question is, in the last 3 years, that is since in this case, February 2020, have you been in any type of road accident, no matter how minor? Please include any accidents in which you're involved as a pedestrian, driver, passenger, cyclist or motorcyclist, even if no other party were involved. Only include incidents that happened on a public road, including pavements and cycle lanes on the public road. So that last bit is pretty comparable with Stats 19 injury coverage. So exactly, they sort of prompt people about things that, nobody else has to be involved, any kind of road accident. So the research questions for my analysis of this data. Firstly, I was looking at the self-report data in comparison with Stats 19. So what is the picture from the self-report data of what kind of incidents are happening, who's being injured, compared to what gets reported to and recorded by the police? And as I say, I'm not saying one's right and one's wrong, but they provide very useful complementary angles. What are the main causes of self-report injuries? So one of the things I wanted to look at was pedestrian-cyclist collisions, because these may well be under-reported, under-recorded in police data. So what about when people are asked specifically about this and prompted, any kind of incident, that it could involve anyone? What do we learn about that? And also controlling for the amount of walking, because it's a travel survey, we know how much walking people do, of course. So this again was really exciting. So I could look at normalising for walking, amount of walking. And the results are published in an article and report, so you can, if the slides are circulated, or I can provide the links. So, some results. Firstly, in terms of the breakdown of injury modes, so sometimes I'm giving you 3-year figures, sometimes 1 year. Now, the 3-year, when people are asked about incidents over 3 years, you obviously get a lot more incidents, right? But recall gets worse. So I think the past year is more accurate. So I've used whichever seemed most appropriate. So when people are asked about involvement in incidents in the past 3 years, this is people who reported that they themselves were injured. So 69% of them were in a car, 12% were cycling, 6% were motorcycling, 8% were pedestrians, and 5% another type of vehicle. It's quite interesting that there's more cyclists than pedestrians, I thought. I also compared this to Stats 19 data, basically prepared a comparable data set from Stats 19, including 1-year data, but excluding deaths, obviously, because they wouldn't be in the National Travel Survey. So this is a comparison in terms of the proportion of injuries by mode. So in Stats 19, 64% of people injured were car occupants. In the National Travel Survey, it's 65%, so very similar. The big difference really is when you look at cyclists. So 8% of people injured in police injury data are cyclists, but 16% in the National Travel Survey data. So that isn't the focus of this talk, but I just think it's kind of interesting. I did a calculation of per mile and per hour risks by mode. So this obviously is related to the last slide, but this kind of quantifies it. So just to pick out a couple of things. So in terms of police injury data, for pedestrians, you're looking at just over 2 injuries per million miles walked. When we look at the National Travel Survey data, that's around 3 times higher. That becomes 6 injuries per million miles walked. So this gives you a sense of the amount of injuries that are potentially out there, but not reported to the police and not recorded for various reasons. As you'd expect, the differential is highest for cyclists, based on the last slide. But it's also, it's sort of ballpark similar for other modes, like 3 or 4 times higher, 3 or 4 times more injuries proportionally in this self-report data set, as one would expect, I think. Who are the other road users? So before I talk a little bit more about pedestrians, it's interesting because you can look at who are the others who are involved in incidents, because people are asked to report what other road users were involved, if any. And in 83% of the other road user involved was a car user. In 13%, it was another type of vehicle, vans and so on, other types of motor vehicle. 1% cyclists, 1% motorcyclists, 1% pedestrians. So overwhelmingly car drivers and to a lesser extent motor vehicle drivers are the other parties involved. So in terms of the injuries to pedestrians and cyclists, so this was a nice sort of way of representing how frequent, in terms of this self-report data, different types of injuries to pedestrians and cyclists are. So this is absolute numbers in the data set, just the numbers of people in this sample survey. So don't worry too much about the actual numbers on the y-axis, it's about the relative frequencies. So the largest group is cyclists in collision with motor vehicles in terms of the injuries among this nationally representative sample survey, followed by, with very similar numbers, cyclists falling off their bike, having a single bicycle incident, and pedestrians colliding with motor vehicles. So those two also relatively frequent. And then not that far behind, pedestrian falls. I think pedestrian falls are potentially still underreported in this data set because I think people may still not report them even if prompted. But, you know, there's still a lot of them potentially that you can analyse. And very, very rare are cyclists injured colliding with pedestrians and pedestrians injured colliding with cyclists, which I found really interesting. I didn't quite expect it to be quite as dramatic as that. So, to move on to pedestrians, I've got a few more slides related to pedestrian injury risk. So this is calculating and normalising for the amount of walking, the relative risk by a range of variables. So to start off with, in terms of gender, normalising by the amount of walking, women were around 2.4 times more likely to be injured in a pedestrian fall than men, and around 20% more likely than men to be injured in a motor vehicle collision. So slightly elevated risk for motor vehicle collisions, substantially elevated risk for falls. By age is interesting. So these are, on the left, you've got motor vehicle injuries, and that's showing after, in relation to the 50 to 59 age group, there's an increase for the 60 to 69 age group in relative risk, but then a quite dramatic one for the 70 plus, around 4 times higher relative risk per mile compared to the 50-somethings group. For falls injury, the gradient is even starker, so perhaps not surprising, but showing just how much risk older pedestrians are in terms of falls. Now, this isn't just older pedestrian issue. This is a street furniture issue. This is a road design issue. So I think it's important to remember this is something we can potentially do something about. But 7 times higher risk per mile of people aged 70 plus in this data set experiencing an injury having fallen as a pedestrian compared to people in their 50s. So, no wonder people are nervous about this. For the motor vehicle injuries, the driving factor for this was disability, the correlation between age and disability. So that was actually driving the motor vehicle, the elevated risk in relation to motor vehicles. And this gives you the chart for pedestrian injury risk, and this one for disability in terms of pedestrian injury risk. And this one I found particularly shocking as well. So this is showing that disabled pedestrians have around 6 times higher risk per mile of being injured in a fall compared to non-disabled pedestrians. And the motor vehicle injuries, it's 4.5 times higher risk per mile of being injured by a motor vehicle. And the falls risk is very much bound up with age, but the motor vehicle injury risk isn't. So younger disabled people are at quite substantially elevated risk compared to non-disabled people of their own age as pedestrians. And I do some more regression modelling in the published work. But yeah, very high relative risk for disabled people as pedestrians. Just a couple of things that sort of highlight this being a justice issue as well. By car ownership, non-car owners are very much more likely per mile walked to be injured in a fall or to be injured by a motor vehicle compared to non-car owners. So 3 times higher risk of being injured by a motor vehicle, 4.5 times higher risk of being injured in a fall. So the people who don't own cars are most at risk from these types of injuries. And not surprisingly, as car ownership is correlated with income, you see a similar gradient by income. So people who, on the lowest income groups, are around 3 times more likely per mile walked to be injured by a motor vehicle than people in the richest groups. In terms of fall injuries, around 3.5 times more likely the poorest are to be injured per mile walked. Oh, I think I sped up too much. Sorry about that. Around 3.5 times more likely to be injured in a fall compared to the richest groups. Now, you know, the income and the car ownership, it's, you know, we could speculate on the causes for that. In terms of car ownership, one factor is related to the kind of areas that people live in, the type of walking they're doing, the type of street environments and so on. But yeah, I think it's important because like these gender gaps and gender biases, it is a social justice issue. The people who are most marginalised, most vulnerable, who benefit least from mass car ownership are being injured at relatively high rates. So for instance, disabled pedestrians walk less than non-disabled pedestrians, partly because of this threatening environment, but they are at much higher risk when they do walk. So these are really important issues, I think, and it needed this data source to be able to analyse this and to be able to bring these kind of issues to light, I think. So, yeah, just concluding then, the underreporting is, you know, as you might expect, around 3 times compared to police injury data, Stats 19. So, you know, that seems about right to me, as far as I can tell. So there's 3 times more self-report injuries as there are injuries that are recorded by the police. Pedestrian cyclist and cyclist-cyclist injury collisions seem rare. So, you know, that hopefully provides some evidence towards the question of, well, are there loads of these things going on, but they're just never reported to the police? It seems not, in terms of the kind of injuries that people are likely to report in a travel survey, for instance. Disabled pedestrians have very high injury risk, both in absolute terms and also adjusted for amount of walking. And this is something we couldn't have looked at without this data. The relative risks are also high for those who don't own cars and who are living on low incomes. And older pedestrians are particularly at risk of falls. And I do think, you know, some of the data analysis I've done looking at qualitative data and looking at people's descriptions of navigating bumpy footways, you know, where the pavement goes up and down, where there's drives, of navigating obstructions, you know, you can see that this isn't something natural. This is something that, you know, policy should be concerned about. And yeah, just finally, these road justice issues can only be visible if we have data with demographic variables attached. So Stats 19 is great in a lot of ways. I've done a lot of analysis with it, but it doesn't have the demographic variables we need for this analysis. And yeah, this allowed that. So I think I am finished. And I apologise, sorry, just before I finish, I apologise because I'm going to have to leave. I have to get back down to London, so I'm going to have to literally leave shortly. Sorry. Thank you very much.
Well, even though we've got you for so short a time, we're really appreciative of you coming to be with us and to share those insights, which I think, you know, are really fascinating and do shine a light on some significant inequalities. I've got a question that's come in from some of our colleagues online. There may be some others. We've probably got time for a couple of questions. The elephant in every room at the moment is e-scooters. And so Nigel has asked whether there was anything in the data coming off NTS that highlighted that you were able to look at. Was it too early?
I mean, this data didn't really have e-scooters in it, but this is something that I would really like to look at. And again, it's very frustrating that there isn't the data that I would like to have. But I think going forward, there will be more of that data on e-scooter use in routine data sets. It will be possible, but it wasn't then, and I don't think it quite is now, is my opinion.
Yeah. Great. Any other questions in the room for Rachel? Yeah, Matthew, let me come to you.
Thanks. So I'm Matthew from DFT, and I've worked in the NTS team, and I currently work in the road safety stats team. I'm sort of kicking myself thinking, what a fantastic analysis, and why didn't I think of doing that like years ago? So the thing I've always wondered about is like ethnicity, and like whether that's a factor, which is in the NTS to a point. Is that something you looked at and it just wasn't a factor, or did you not look at it?
So, no, great question. Thank you very much. And yes, so we did. The problem was that with the numbers being relatively low, even though combining as many years as I could, when you collapsed it into white versus non-white, I feel like a lot of stuff was hidden. I would have liked to have done, you know, a more broken down analysis. So I think it is in the report. I mean, and I don't think there were that. I don't think I found that much, but I thought that was because the numbers were relatively low, you know, across the country, something like 88% white or something. So the numbers, even when you collapsed white, non-white, the numbers became relatively small. And then I think you kind of lost, you know, the breakdowns, I think, for instance, between different ethnicity categories would be more, would tell you more. So I think there wasn't the numbers, and also even with that sort of crude categorisation, I think a lot was hidden. But yeah, I think it would also be really interesting. And I think TfL and Stats 19 have some kind of ethnicity breakdown in that. So occasionally I think, I'd be really interested to look at that, but I've never got round to it.
Well, that will be a nice segue into our next presentation. So, but in the meantime, Rachel, through these doors, there's some fruit and some pastries. If you've got to, you know, sort of hot foot to the train, feel free to take some sustenance to carry you on your way. And can we express our appreciation to Rachel one more time? Yeah, it was almost like, you know, sort of the perfect segue to Zoe and Rhiannon from TfL talking about unequal road outcomes and the work that they've been doing to explore that with the TfL data. So over to you guys.
Lovely, thank you very much, and thanks for the invite today. So we've got just a bit of an introduction and context for you, and then I'm going to hand over to Rhiannon to do methodology results, and then I'm going to talk to you about what our next steps are for this work. So the Mayor of London, he wants it obviously to be safer, he wants it to be greener, but he also wants it to be a fairer and more prosperous city. And so within our Vision Zero Action Plan progress report, we detail how we wanted to really dig into the Stats 19 data and really investigate kind of how unequal road outcomes manifest among different demographics and communities. And this is something that we have looked at quite some years ago in both deprivation and ethnicity. However, we really haven't had kind of a legacy. And so I think it's fallen a little bit by the wayside. And we just wanted to pick it up again and shine a light on it, look at the Stats 19 in a different way. So we feel like it's really important to look at this and assign sort of a casualty rate to what groups are being most impacted and how then we tackle that and narrow those gaps. We feel this gives us a better understanding of road danger and really informing kind of future investment, both in kind of scheme design, but also in our communications, marketing, education. So we can look at both aspects of that, so where the injury is happening and also who the injury is happening to and how we protect them, how we tackle those sources of danger to protect those most kind of impacted by road danger. So this is what we did. We looked at Stats 19. We only looked at Stats 19 with this very foundational level, and we just wanted to get that kind of pure sort of data set looked at first and then hopefully build on that later. So looking at Stats 19, we used 2017 data to 2021, but obviously with the pandemic in the middle, we've really focused on 2017 to 2019 as our baseline, and then we can track that kind of going forward. We have pulled out within sort of our upcoming report, which hopefully will be published. We're saying spring, so hopefully soon we'll let you know when that is. Just going through finalisation now, we have pulled out sort of any specific data for 2020 and 2021 where that's possible. So we wanted to look at all modes within that. We wanted to look at age, we wanted to look at sex, and then overlaying it with the indices of multiple deprivation. We wanted to pull all that together and really kind of identify who what we're coining as our high-risk communities are. So challenges with any data set. Yes, ethnicity is collected in London at local level, but there is a high level of not stated. So we felt that data wasn't robust, so we have parked that for now and something to definitely come back to. Disability data, as Rachel said, isn't collected within Stats 19. We haven't been able to look at exposure because of the level that we've looked at, that kind of lower super output area. I'll come on to that in a minute. Obviously, population changes with the 2011 census data, missing information, self-reporting versus police recorded. And what we haven't done yet, and again, something to come back to later, is involvement in collisions, so those who are injuring others. So I shall hand over to Rhiannon, who's going to tell you. Oh, no, sorry, one more slide from me. Apologies. Just a bit of a step back. So indices of multiple deprivation, for those who may or may not have worked with this. So just a bit of a scene set, really. So indices of multiple deprivation is a measure of relative deprivation of that small local area called a lower super output area. And it's this granularity that we don't have that exposure data for. And so it's these small areas in England are ranked from most deprived to least deprived, sort of 1 to 32,000. But to simplify the process, it's carved up into deciles, so 10 equal portions. So decile 1 being the most deprived, decile 10 being the least deprived of that. And the idea of the LSOA is that they're a standard geography of a specific site, so roughly about 1,500 residents. So we can easily compare those across. So where you've got green areas, those LSOAs are going to be bigger. Where you've got a high urban area, those areas are going to be smaller to identify. And so within London, we've looked at 4,835 LSOAs as part of this work. Hand over.
Yeah, so our kind of big exam question was, how can we try to understand how road danger varies by inequality and the other demographic factors that we have access to in Stats 19? So any metrics that we used would need to combine a few of the following features. We'd obviously want to use the data from Stats 19 on the demographics, so looking at age, the sex of the casualty, the collision location, and also we have access to the casualty's home postcode. So with that, we can infer some kind of deprivation information from IMD. Also, ideally, we'd want to use a rate measure that takes into account some sort of idea of the movement on the roads or the exposure of the individuals. And also, we really wanted this to be quite granular, because London has hugely diverse communities living next door to each other. So aggregating by areas like borough can kind of average out results. So we wanted it to be quite granular, which is kind of why we've used the indices of multiple deprivation, because it's at that LSOA local area. So we came up with two ways of understanding how road danger varies by inequality. So the first looks at where the casualty happened. So how does road danger vary by the deprivation of the location of the collision? So here, to calculate the casualty location rate, we've just got the number of casualties divided by the road length to give us some sort of standardization of the amount of road that someone can get injured on. So this gives us the casualties per kilometre of road. And then the second way to look at this is to look at the characteristics of the person involved. So to create this casualty rate, we just looked at the number of casualties divided by the total number of that relevant population. So for example, you'd have a casualty rate for women versus men divided by the relevant size of that population. As I mentioned, for both metrics, we've looked at the baseline, 2017 to 19, and also, where appropriate, we've kind of combined the 30% most and the 30% least deprived areas, just for ease of analysis. So there are some strengths and weaknesses to both of these approaches. So for the casualty location rate per kilometre, the strengths are that the road length gives us some indication of sort of area available for collisions to occur. But, of course, it doesn't take into account anything about the busyness of that road or the number of junctions, the speed limit, anything like that. And then for the casualty rate per 1,000 of the population, this allows an understanding of which communities in London's population have higher casualty rates. But we still don't have an understanding of exactly how many of those people in those communities are travelling and by which mode. So some limitations there. So what did we find? So this chart here shows the deprivation along the x-axis, with most deprived on the left and least deprived on the right. And the casualty location rate is just shown by the line. So you can clearly see here that the most deprived areas in London by far have the highest casualty rates. And in fact, the 30% most deprived postcodes have double the casualty rate than the least deprived 30%. So this is for all casualties, but we see the same results for KSIs as well. When we look at the casualty rate per 1,000 of the population, we basically see the same results. So again, this chart shows a direct linear relationship between the deprivation of the area of where someone lives and the number of casualties per 1,000 people. And again, this chart is looking at all casualties, but these results are also true for killed and seriously injured collisions as well. So when we look at the results by age group, so this chart shows the KSI rates for the 30% most deprived in pink, the middle deprivation 40%, which is sort of teal, and the least deprived 30%, which is dark green. And this shows how those different deprivation groups vary by age group, which is along the x-axis here. So for all deprivation groups, the KSIs per 1,000 people increases from kind of early and primary school years to peak at age group 16 to 30, and then decreases in later life. As Rachel mentioned earlier, there's a bit of a final uptick in the oldest age group, so potentially kind of more vulnerable road users kind of having an uptick in KSIs in later life. You can also see from this chart that across all age groups, again, thank you, the most deprived communities have the highest KSI rates, so the pink line essentially is always above the other two lines. When we look at casualty rates split by sex, so for all casualties and for KSIs, men actually have a higher rate of injury than women across all deprivation areas. So this chart here shows the KSI casualty rates, and again we've got deprivation along the x-axis, and you can see that the casualty rate for men is shown in purple, and you can see again that the men living in the most deprived areas have higher KSI rates than men living in least deprived areas. Interestingly, this is not really true for women, so we can see a much flatter line here for the KSI rates for women, indicating more equality in rates across deprivation areas for women. So we can combine the demographic factors that we've looked at, so deprivation, sex, age, and mode of travel, to highlight which populations are most frequently killed or seriously injured on London's roads. So these are our kind of higher risk communities. So this table shows the top 5 highest KSI rates per 1,000 people of the relevant population. And we can see that this list is dominated by the most deprived people in London, male motorcyclists and pedestrians as well. So as a quick summary of all of those results that I've just whizzed through, so twice as many people were killed or seriously injured per kilometre of road in the most deprived 30% of London than in the least deprived 30%. Almost twice as many people living in the most deprived 30% of London are killed or seriously injured than people living in the least deprived areas. More men are injured than women, and this difference increases with deprivation and injury severity. So actually 3 times more men than women are killed or seriously injured from the most deprived 30% of London. Young adults between 16 and 30 are more frequently killed or seriously injured than any other age group. So we did some regression analysis to kind of look at which of these demographic factors was kind of most predictive of KSI risk. And when controlling for mode of travel, sex has the largest impact on the killed or seriously injured rate. And we kind of saw that in the big difference between the male and female casualty rates. Deprivation had the second largest impact, which, as we've seen throughout, there's significantly higher casualty rates for the most deprived areas of London than in the least. Thank you.
So what do we do now with this information? There's a lot more that we can do. Like I said, we're hoping to publish in the coming weeks, and then what we want to do is disseminate that. So talk to our borough officers and really kind of, again, look at what that data means at each individual borough level. This is obviously pan-London. What does it mean for their individual areas? So talking to our borough colleagues, speaking to our policing partners and our stakeholders to really kind of dig into this data. And at granular level, kind of what's causing some of these inequalities. We want this to inform not only Transport for London's future programmes, but also those of the boroughs as well. So identifying locations where there's a higher collision rate. So this will be another data set that is complementary to all of the other data sets that we already use to identify, but maybe as a tool for additional prioritisation when funding is a bit tight. And also looking at kind of how we engage, how we educate and how we communicate with those local communities as well. I think it's really important to review our existing programmes, especially for the sort of the 16 to 30. We have a young person's programme, but we really need to kind of step back, have a look at what our current offer is and whether that is effective, what more we can do, and potentially as a starting point, and then we can develop potentially others if we don't see that fits the bill. Continue working with our policing partners to improve data. It's always on the radar in terms of a better collection of data set. Investigate our current gaps. So we know we have gaps for ethnic grouping, we know we have gaps for disability, and potentially some other protected characteristics which aren't captured there, but there may be some inequality arising. There's also identifying external parties and additional grant funding opportunities, and also looking to future research. So again, this is a start of kind of, I think, a bigger journey, and yeah, a lot of work to do. So a lot more discussions to be had. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Really interesting. Again, we've got opportunity for a couple of questions from the floor, so let me come here. I've got something that's come in from online as well. Yeah, if you'd like to introduce yourself as well.
Good morning, thank you. I'm Joy Atkin from Hertfordshire Constabulary, Casualty Reduction Analyst. I just wondered, when you were talking about your deprivation scales, was it general deprivation scales, or did you break it down to look at the social deprivation or income or crime? Because there's obviously different ones. I just wondered which one you'd used.
Good question. We use the combined overall IMD score, so it's obviously like a sort of weighted combination of all of those different factors, yeah. But it would be interesting to do, I don't know, to look at something more specific, which might kind of bring, I think what this analysis is kind of missing is more of those sort of causal questions, which maybe doing an analysis like that might start to illuminate.
Okay, I'm going to come all the way to you, Jamie. I'm going to get a little run on as well, so that we can bring you into the conversation.
Hi, Jamie Hassel, National Highways. I'm really interested in the earlier presentations and how it links with your work. Especially, I'm interested in sort of lead safety indicators or safety performance indicators. So I'm really interested in the percentage of women, say, using bikes as an indicator for safety, and that actually, if that went up, it would probably make it safer for men, so that would come down, but you might then find an increase in women. So have you looked at sort of safety indicators or sort of how you can assess what's happening and how, to track improvement and change?
Not yet. I think this was kind of our beginning look into how things vary by sex and by age, because I think we just didn't really know what the picture was to a certain extent. So I think we're very much at the beginning of understanding the patterns of this in London, but I think that could be a really great next step.
Okay, one more quick question from our audience who've joined us online. Jonathan asked, whether anything was done to adjust for the massive disparity on deprivation, particularly the spread among the top deciles, which are much greater than the lower. So obviously, you get a lot of spread at the top end, and whether you've done anything at that end, or whether you'd sort of focused on those coming from poorer communities.
No, so I think we kind of made the choice just to use the national data set because it's just nice and comparable with lots of other analysis that's been going on. But I think, I don't know, your idea about maybe looking specifically at sort of the individual pillars that make up the IMD could be quite a useful next step, because then we can look more specifically at things like income and access to services and how that impacts it. But yeah, not yet.
Great, thank you. Could we just express our appreciation to Rhiannon and Zoe as well. So you may have realised we've got something of a gender data gap to address in our lineup this morning, because so far we haven't had any blokes presenting. So Philip is our next presenter and going to help us to bring a little bit of sort of balance to things. So for those of you who don't know, although I'm sure many of you will, Philip comes from C-Sense. who really have sort of been pushing the boundaries of what technology can inform us on data coming off bikes. So great to have you with us, Philip, and looking forward to what you've got to say.
I'm very pleased to say that I am actually the only male person involved in the preparation of this presentation, and I'm actually the understudy today for Irene, our Chief Strategy Officer. So, but we good to, I guess, have a male perspective on things as well. So, in terms of cycling, should get the right slide. All urban design, including cycling, is not neutral. It either perpetuates or reduces social inequity. When we think about cycling, which image comes to mind? Is it Apana, the lady on the right, who's cycling in jeans to pick up her children from school? Or is it the guys on the left, the mammals, the middle-aged men in Lycra? Or as I've heard them referred to more recently, the cobwebs, the crusty old blokes with expensive bikes? Of which, admittedly, I'm probably one. We know from a recent Sustrans report that 55% of minority groups, 38% of people living in deprivation, 36% of women, and 31% of those with a disability who do not currently cycle would like to. But quite often, our policy serves those already cycling, the privileged. So we need more data, and we need better data to be able to do a better job. The problem, as we've seen already, is that Stats 19, it's got lots of challenges. It's a great data set, but there's lots of underreporting on there. Obviously, surveys are very time-consuming and subject to a lot of bias. Census information is every 10 years, and the last one was during a pandemic, so probably not that great. Apps tend to go either into the app graveyard on your phone, or if you're using them regularly, they're quite often for sporting or measuring your performance purposes. That's a lot of bias in the demographic there as well. And of course, counters and videos, video information is really useful, but it's typically too sparse and doesn't really have that demographic information that we need as well. So how do we get some better data? So I'll talk a little bit about our technology, and then we'll look a bit about how we're closing some of those gaps in gender equality for those living in deprivation, and touching a little bit in Vision Zero as well, because quite often cycling is the piece that's least represented when it comes to figuring out how to improve and meet those aims. So what we do is we've got technology. It looks like a regular bike light, but it's crammed with communications and sensors technology. And what it does is, as you're cycling around, it's profiling you and the environment around you to understand how you're interacting with that environment and what the environment is like. So for the cyclist, there's some really good benefits. It's looking at things like, are you at a road junction, a roundabout, filtering in traffic? And in those situations where we know statistically you're at a higher risk than in other situations, it will flash brighter and faster to help keep you safe. It also, if you opt in, allows us to collect data around your rides, and we aggregate lots of that data up to get some really fascinating insights. We run dedicated sensors and AI on the devices. That gives us a very rich and granular picture. The image on the left is with a resolution of 800 readings per second. The one on the right is 10 readings per second that you would get from an app on a mobile phone, and that sort of thing. And you can see very clearly the difference in the amount of data and detail that you can get from it. We do lots of different things around braking, swerving, road roughness, collisions, and so on. But importantly, whenever we're deploying these, we can actually target particular groups, so we can get good representation of minority groups, of those living in deprivation, of different genders, and so on. And we also allow people to drop pins in maps and tell us about their experience. And that's really interesting because it means we get both sides of the equation. We get the perception, which is super important, because whether or not somebody rides will be determined by how they feel about safety and their perception of safety. And then we get the actual measured information about how often did they brake and swerve, how suddenly did they brake and swerve, and quite often those higher order derivatives are much more telling around what really happened in the environment. So, braking hard doesn't necessarily represent a problem, but if you brake suddenly, it's much more likely that something caught you out, and that's much more interesting when we come to urban planning. And we don't just do bikes, we're actually on e-scooters and on hire bike fleets as well. So let's have a little look at women's cycling. We did an analysis in Dublin a couple of years ago where we had good representation of both male and female cyclists. We actually, the grey line that you see in the middle is actually non-binary cyclists who actually, the data came out to be quite similar to the male cyclists. And what we see quite clearly is that there is a different experience of male cyclists and female cyclists travelling along the same roads in Dublin. And so we thought, well, how can that be? You know, we've accounted for the weight of the rider, the type of the bike, whether or not they've got suspension, how big their tyres are, what tyre pressure's in it. All of that is accounted for using our sensor technology. So we've got a level playing field. We've got data which is standardised. But yet we were seeing these differences. We looked into it much more deeply and we realised that the most likely cause is that the female cyclists were travelling closer to the curb than their male counterparts. And because of the camber of the road, the water runs down and road deterioration tends to happen closest to the curb. And so that's what we were seeing. We were seeing these female cyclists experiencing much rougher road surfaces as a result of their lane positioning within the road. For International Women's Day in 2021, we did a study of 800 cyclists in London over 18 months. You'll forgive the pink for ladies and blue for guys. This was prepared by Dr. Rachel Irwin, our data scientist, and I'll very happily, you can ask her the choice of colours there. But what was really, really striking and interesting in London is that we saw exactly the opposite. So for male cyclists that were travelling on the same roads as female cyclists, we were seeing that actually it was the guys that were experiencing the rougher road surface. And again, we set ourselves a challenge of figuring out why that was. You know, we scratched our head, we looked at our analysis. Was there something we missed in Dublin the first time around? But it turns out that female cyclists are much more likely to select the infrastructure. And so they were choosing to stay on the excellent cycle superhighways that we have in and around London. Whereas on those same roads, quite often the guys in certain areas were using the road as opposed to the cycle path. And the road was rougher than the cycle path, and therefore we're seeing differences in that as well. So down to really interesting around how people make choices around routes and how they choose to use infrastructure or not. It's not just for cities as well. It does work in areas of deprivation. So we were absolutely delighted to work with Active Essex and Essex County Council on a project called Essex Pedal Power, which is ongoing at the moment. So more than 1,000 bicycles given out to an area of deprivation, so Jaywick and Clacton primarily, in Essex, and some really, really interesting findings there. Who knew that Tuesday down at the pier was the place to be? But over and above that, social cycling, we saw a lot of utility cycling as well. We saw some interesting challenges in the environment. So, an area here where you've got a shop that people want to access, but quite a difficult and complex road network to get there. And so we see cyclists taking shortcuts, bumping their bikes up the curb and travelling along the footpath in order to access that. We also see some areas of high levels of swerving. So we see some challenges around interactions with pedestrians and bicycles on these very nice paths along by the shore. And indeed, the moving sand as well tends to cause narrowing of the areas. And we've a really interesting story there of a cyclist that stopped, and there was lots of interesting moving around and so on. When we asked them what was going on, what would we doing in that environment, it was actually a lady on a mobility scooter that had become stuck in the sand, and they'd stopped to help them out. So some really, really interesting and different insights in non-urban environments as well. And some of the challenges that we see in London, we also see in Essex as well, where we've got various different road features. So at the top there, you see quite limited sight lines, which lead to unexpected, late sightings of between bicycles and cars, and some braking there, and also an area where you've got the lane restricting with parking and lanes disappearing on the left and right, which causes some challenge in the interaction between different types of vehicles. Touching on Vision Zero, as Rachel very eloquently put it, and indeed our colleagues from TfL earlier, Stats 19 is somewhat limited in that it's only where someone is injured or killed that it will typically be in that report. And the more slight the injury, the more likely it is to go underreported. Our data goes all the way down to the near miss and harsh braking stuff. And so we're able to look at the Stats 19 data and our data around where people are braking and swerving unusually, and see, is there a correlation there? And I'm delighted to say that we've worked with a number of organisations, primarily ROSPA, the Royal Society for the Prevention of Accidents, with TfL, with your colleagues in London, with the Transport Accident Commission, which are a government organisation in Australia, looking at obviously how to improve research. What we find is that there is a very good correlation, so you're 2.5 times more likely to brake or swerve suddenly and unexpectedly in an area where there is been a Stats 19 collision than you are when you're not. So what does that look like in real terms? So this is Regent's Park in London. The black dots that you see there are Stats 19 recorded collisions, and those vertical bars are indications of where we see unusual braking and swerving. So what we can see is that there is a correlation. There are some areas where we've seen Stats 19 historic collisions, but we're still seeing in the environment today unusual braking and swerving activity. Those are areas where, of course, we can send out someone to have a look and understand what's happening in the environment. We're seeing Stats 19 where there isn't any indication, which is a great potential indication that there isn't a problem there, that it was a one-off event. And there are obviously some areas there where we're seeing quite large bars, but no Stats 19, which is perhaps an area of concern that we should have a look at what is actually going on in that environment. We did a really interesting study as well of Park Lane, which received some new infrastructure, so a cycling lane, around the time of COVID. A little bit difficult to kind of work out what's going on in that graph, but the dotted line that extends down to the bottom right are basically everything that's bad, and the solid lines are significantly better. And we saw that transition overnight. When the cycle lane went in, just immediately like that, all of the bad stuff went away. So all of the really nasty braking and swerving and unusual stuff. So a really, really good indication that actually that works, that we don't have to wait 2 or 3 years to see if anything turns up in Stats 19, but we can actually be much more measured and considerate in the way that we do our transport planning today. And with that, I'd be delighted to take your questions.
Fantastic. It's really interesting stuff. I got a sneak peek of some of these slides a couple of weeks ago in another meeting. So anyone got any questions that they'd like to throw at Philip about the data? No. Bruce, come to you.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, Philip. There's a lot of interesting evidence there. This is a genuine question about your presentation that we've been mulling over here. The numbers on the X and Y axes on the charts, yes. What did they represent? What were they scaling? We were unclear about what we were looking at. I got that the higher means more, but that was as far as I could get.
Yes, it is. So it's a proprietary measure. It's a measure of how suddenly you brake or swerve. So if you imagine you're coming, you're traveling down a hill to a road junction, you may brake quite hard in order to be able to stop on that advanced stop line or on that stop line. So that in itself is not particularly interesting. So how heavily you brake is not that cool. What is really interesting is how suddenly you brake. So you will typically apply your brakes quite progressively in that situation, whereas if you're cycling along and you think that a pedestrian or may step out in front of you, or you spot something unexpected on the roadway, a pothole or an object at the last moment, you're much more likely to snatch the brakes, particularly very quickly initially. And so it's that snatch is really, the more you snatch, the faster you snatch, the more that appears down on the right-hand side of those graphs, if that helps.
Great, sure. Thank you. A question that's come in from one of our colleagues online, from Morgan, asking, who is actually using these devices, and are you working with local authorities to encourage uptake? Yeah. How are you getting the devices sort of out into market to gather that evidence?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we sold more than 100,000 of them around the UK, so we've got a very good organic audience of people who are opting in to collect data and allow us to understand a lot of what's happening. We have worked with a number of local authorities, so they've been integrated into LC whips and various different ways of measuring things. The Active Essex project is obviously a great example of for a monitoring and evaluation project to understand how people are using bicycles that are being given out and where different improvements can be made. Typically when we work with a local authority, there'll be an organic amount of cyclists already using our technology. We look at the demographics of that, and then we work with that authority to see, Do we need to specifically target different groups in order to balance out the data or to look in particular areas that are of interest to them? And it could be they've got a lot of data already on the mammal cyclists, and they want to look more at female cyclists or different age groups or people leaving their kids to and from school, those sorts of things. And so we can target those people and get some lights out to them.
Great. Philip, thank you. C-Sense are one of our exhibitors out in the coffee area. So during the breaks over lunch, do grab Philip if you've got any more questions. But can we just express our appreciation once again? Great, so it comes to our last speaker for this session. So my privilege to introduce Nicola to you. Nicola has spoken at Joining the Dots previously in a kind of pre-pandemic life, I think that was. Nicola is the Chief Executive of SOMO, and we're sort of segueing now from less of the cycling data, but nonetheless delving into an interesting data gap around ethnicity. So Nicola, over to you.
Thank you, everybody. It's really interesting listening to all the presentations that clearly inequity is a major, major part of a lot of the presentations we're hearing, and people have had to work quite hard to find that in the data. It's not always easily identifiable. This presentation takes a slightly different direction. We do start with a bit of a data story, but we move on to kind of looking at, well, so what? When you discover an inequity, what can you do? So, and also I'm old school, so I've got my little cards. There you go. Rightio, let's get going. So I'm, as Dan introduced me, I'm Nicola Wass. I'm the CEO of a behavioural science consultancy, and we use psychology, neuroscience and social sciences to understand the drivers of choice and behaviour. Also, I have to apologise if anybody's heard this presentation a bit before. We've been speaking on it quite a lot. But one of the things I always find is when I introduce myself and say where I'm from, I get one of two responses. There are people who are intrigued and they're interested and they want to come talk to me and ask, well, what do behavioural scientists do in this area? And there are those who are slightly more suspicious. Am I one of those people who goes around trying to manipulate people's behaviour without their knowledge? You know, what's behavioural science? Is it a science? Or is it the dark arts? I've even heard that. Well, you're going to have to make your own mind up about that. But to do so, let's take a case study of a recent piece of work that we've done. It was for Birmingham City Council and it was funded by the Road Safety Trust. So we'll go back to the beginning. So in about 2017, Birmingham City Council approached us and they were concerned about an area of the city known as East Birmingham, which was experiencing very high casualty rates. Birmingham City Council knew that this was an area with very high concentration of South Asian residents, and they also admitted that they had had problems with engaging with these communities before, and indeed interventions that had been effective elsewhere in the city were having naught to negative effect in these areas. So they were quite concerned, but they didn't know the reasons why, and they weren't sure what to do about it. But they did have a hypothesis. And at the time, Birmingham's best guess about these high road traffic casualties, they thought was down to kind of young men driving around in high-performance cars and running amok amongst the communities. And that seems a bit reductive, doesn't it? But you've got to remember that these are very salient incidents when they occur, and fairly recently there had been a series of issues. But were they correct? Well, not quite. A look at the data showed that targeting drivers of prestige cars would have had almost no impact on this problem. Because what collision data showed, alongside evidence from community interviews, was that whilst young men driving high-performance cars were both visible and annoying to residents, the actual number of casualties attributable to them was very small. And you can see from this graph on the right, this is just one small part of East Birmingham. But what we also discovered was that the majority of passenger casualties were indeed experienced by people of South Asian origin. But what was really interesting was that the real reason that we were seeing for such high casualties came down to an unusual and very high amount of passenger casualties, which were accounted for about 33%. So to us, that suggested that the problem may lie in non-seatbelt use. But again, this is just a hypothesis. So we wanted to test that. So we conducted an observational study of 507 vehicles. And what that revealed was really quite stark. If we consider that 8% of car occupants are considered not to be wearing a seatbelt, what we were finding in those areas was that figure rose to 5 times that, and we were seeing non-wearing rates around 38%, which is shockingly high. Further analysis confirmed that most of these casualties were indeed experienced by people of South Asian origin. So what had gone wrong? Now, the UK is known for being pretty successful in relation to tackling seatbelt use, changes to legislation, use of enforcement, and also for running a series of very well-promoted seatbelt campaigns over the course of over 10 years. So, you know, if we attribute at least part of that success to those campaigns, then why had decades of these campaigns failed to reach and to change the behaviour of this population? What had gone wrong? Well, we had a little look and we reviewed seatbelt campaigns over the years, and I'm talking to you about inequity, so you're going to spot this yourselves. But there were 2 things that were pretty consistent in the historic campaigns. First of all, most of them used emotion as a lever for behavioural change. But secondly, most of the narratives featured people of white British origin, aside from one minor character, I think it was in around 2006, and the general context appeared to be kind of nice, middle-income suburbs. So why should that matter? You know, a person's a person, surely. Well, it does matter. And the reason for that is, whilst emotion is a very effective lever of change, it's most effective when the viewer is able to identify with the person that they see in that campaign. If the person you are seeing doesn't reflect your experience of the world, research shows that you will pay less attention and you will have poorer recall of message. So had a failure to reflect the lives of South Asian communities inadvertently resulted in message not received? Well, we wanted to know the answer to that as well. And so we developed a logic, and our logic was this. If we could increase the use of seatbelts, we would see a reduction in passenger casualties. But any intervention we designed would need to be targeted and tailored to a South Asian demographic. Great. Except not great, because none of us know what it means to be a South Asian person living in Birmingham today, and particularly because Birmingham wanted us to focus on the 16 to 24 age group. What the hell does it mean to be a South Asian Birmingham teenager? I don't know. And to try to create a set of behaviourally optimised messages without that was just going to lead to failure. So what we did was we recruited an ethnographic community, an online ethnographic community of over 20 young people of South Asian heritage. And they worked with us for a number of weeks. We'd set them daily tasks, and they'd upload data and information via their phones. And through this, we were able to gain a wealth of insight into their daily lives, their viewing habits, and of course, their car journeys. We were also very interested in their perception of risk. And through this platform, we discovered that young people did not consider lack of a seatbelt as particularly high risk. So, any attempt to influence their behaviour by using fear-based campaigns that directly linked the act of not wearing a seatbelt with certain death or horrific injuries was likely to be unsuccessful. We needed a different approach. So we went back and we worked with our young people and we tested various insights, and we tested insights into their behaviours. And eventually we discovered something quite powerful. And that was all of the young people we were working with were susceptible to something known as anticipated regret. Now, anticipated regret is a negative feeling or a negative emotion that you will experience in the present moment when you imagine the future consequence of a particular behaviour. And in quite a lot of studies, anticipated regret is being seen as quite a powerful lever of behaviour. So we wanted to work with that. So our next question was, instead of linking the act of not wearing a seatbelt with certain death, instead of looking at harnessing this insight about anticipatory regret, what was it that these young people cherished, that they saw as something that they were going to attain in their near future, that they would regret losing if they were in a collision and it led to an injury? So one of the things that young people shared with us was that family and educational attainment were very important to this group. We learned a lot else, and I don't have time to share that with you. But you can see here some prototypes that young people started making with us to see how they might embed the insight of anticipated regret in a set of messaging. And eventually we arrived at these two that again picked up on family, educational attainment. Marriage was important to both males and females from this group. And we found that losing either would trigger a feeling of regret. So that was something we could work with. We developed the two behavioural optimism campaigns. Great. But we wouldn't know whether either of these would have any real power unless we could put them to the test. And to do that, we needed something to test them against. So we selected the most recent national campaign, and we identified a recent regional campaign, and we created a third asset. And we use this as a decoy because this was information only and it contained no behavioural levers at all. It's just factual information. So the new messaging was evaluated using a randomised survey which was completed by 400 18 to 24-year-olds, of which roughly half identified as South Asian. And each respondent was shown only one of 5 possible campaigns. What we wanted to understand was we wanted to measure their intention on viewing it, what they thought the intention of their peers might be, the emotional response viewing that image elicited in them, and how likely they were to share the campaign with others. So what did the results reveal? Well, interestingly, the tailored campaigns outperformed all of the other campaigns for all young people. And that was very interesting because it meant that the insights we'd developed and uncovered with the South Asian young people were actually applicable and transferable to all young people. But then we separated the responses. And looking across, we saw, again, quite similar patterns of response aside from one specific area. Can you guess which one that was? I feel like a teacher now. Don't have to put your hand up. It was emotion. So those who identified as South Asian showed a 35% increase in the number of emotions generated from viewing the tailored campaign. And that supports the proposition that people are more likely to empathise and feel an emotional response when they identify with the campaign actor and its content. So what next? Well, SOMO, like our partners from Birmingham, like our partners in the Road Safety Trust who funded this work, are committed to real-world behaviour change. So whilst the results from this research were highly promising, we still can't be certain that they will have the necessary impact in the real world. You know, any of you who've got a teenager will see how they scroll through their phones. How can we compete? Well, that's what we're doing now. We're working with young South Asian content creators, and the work has now gone to cover the whole of the West Midlands, and we're working with our partners at Transport for West Midlands in developing that. And perhaps, you know, maybe next year I'll be here telling you the results of that. But I'm having numbers waved at me now, so I'm going to wrap up. But it would be remiss of me to finish talking about this particular piece of work without at least giving you an opportunity to see the context in which I'm discussing and some of the young people who participate in the co-design community. So I'm going to hope that this plays. Yes.
The communities are really close bonded. Everyone knows each other, so it's a really busy area. When you're there, you're at home and everything is around you. I feel proud that I was involved in this campaign because now I know that change can actually happen.
I feel pride because, again, the whole reason I joined the project was to cause an impact, and I'm glad that we have actually made an impact.
Well, I think it's an astonishing statistic, and I think it's really important that you've discovered that because it shows that, that we need to take some action.
Whenever we would go in the car, we wouldn't think to put on our seatbelt straight away. It would always be something that we think about halfway through the journey, or sometimes not even in the journey.
It's been a long-standing thing within the South Asian community, and it needs to change. And it hurts me a lot, the fact that these issues are happening. And so I think representation is important, because I feel like people not from the South Asian community, they wouldn't really understand the issue.
I think it's important because I'm a young person and obviously a South Asian, and I live within these communities. Therefore, I have an insight of what happens in the community and the people around me and the problems that happen in this area.
This is a co-design project, seems to me really important, because if we want to try and change the behaviour of young people, then we need to work with the young people and actually start from their ideas.
Working with Solmo was great, because the project was really linear, and it was kind of like step by step. And then once everyone got talking, got a bit more comfortable, then a lot of people started speaking out and speaking on the project itself, and you can see by the results that it was clearly a good project.
I would definitely influence people to become a co-designer because it's really fun, it lets you be creative, and you get to say your own ideas and voice what you're thinking.
We've had road safety strategies for decades, and we now need something different. I think we need to actually up the ante and say that we cannot tolerate any more deaths on the road.
Hopefully it might minimise a death or two in the future, and if it does that, then we've done our job.
So that was a case study, but there's perhaps a more serious point to this that sits above it all. Oh, no, you don't want to watch that again. And it's good, but not that good. Why is this work significant? Well, perhaps one of the most important things for you to understand is this. The approach demonstrated here can be applied to speed reduction, to modal shift, to climate change. And by taking a diagnostic approach, you'll understand the why of the problem. And once you uncover the why, you're in with a real chance of creating population-level change. But let's see who is paying attention. Let me take you back to the beginning. I asked you, what's behavioural science? Is it an art? Is it a science? Is it the dark arts? Well, it's not the dark arts, is it? But in reality, it feels like it's a little bit of the lot. We use a diagnostic approach, use a lot of scientific method, but also there's creativity research, lateral thinking. And to be honest with you, when you do uncover the why, when you do start to see meaningful change, it can feel just a little bit like magic. So thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Nicola. We're not going to take any questions at this point. For those of you who want to buttonhole Nicola over coffee, then please do so, because I want to make sure that you get time for your coffee break, because we're actually right on time, which is great. We've got 20 minutes now to run through into the atrium, grab yourself some refreshment. Please do speak to our partners and sponsors who are exhibiting there and at the back of the room, but please be back in your seats for 12 o'clock, because we've got a fantastic session next. We've got our panel discussion, which is going to be hosted by Professor Nick Reed. Really interesting panel to discuss data for the safe system. So look forward to seeing you in 20 minutes.